At 6:58 on a Wednesday evening, the baker's son reached across his own counter, pulled a warm loaf of bread out of an old woman's hands, and dropped it back into the display case in front of 11 waiting customers. She did not fight him for it. She had learned a long time ago that fighting men like him in a room full of witnesses cost more than the bread itself. She turned, walked out through the same wooden door she had walked through 5,000 times before he was even born, and did not look back. What he did not know, standing behind that counter with flour still on his hands, was that his own surname was only the second one ever painted on the sign above that door. And that by the following evening, every trader in the market would know exactly whose name had been painted there first. 10 minutes earlier, a 19-year-old apprentice named Tobena had wrapped that same loaf in newspaper and pressed it into her hands without a word, the way he did 3 or 4 evenings a week whenever the owner's son was in the back office and could not see the scale. Tobena had learned, the way apprentices learn, to give what little he could when nobody important was watching. Adaize Okafor had walked the half-kilometer from her room off Modebe Avenue to Onitsha Main Market almost every evening for 12 years, timing her arrival to the 15 minutes before closing, when whatever bread hadn't sold could sometimes be had for 50 naira instead of 300, and on a good night, for nothing at all. She was 71 years old and weighed 49 kilograms, 11 kilograms less than the year her husband died, because she had spent over a decade teaching her body to run on 1 full meal instead of 2. She wore a wrapper of indigo cloth she had bought new from a trader on Newmarket Road in 1994, washed by hand every Sunday night, and a plastic basin behind her room. The hem mended 3 times with thread that did not quite match. The cloth was old. It was not dirty. Under a wooden stool with one short leg in that same room, she kept a tin box that had once held Andrew's liver salt. Inside it sat one key, brass, its bow worn smooth from 12 years of being turned over in her palm, even though it no longer opened anything, and a single sheet of paper folded into eighths. The ink bled soft and blue at every crease. She did not take it out often. She knew what it said. Most nights she did not touch the box at all. She simply knew where it was, the way a person knows where a scar is under a sleeve, without needing to look at it to feel its outline. 41 years before that Wednesday evening, Adaize and her husband Emeka had run the only bakery on that stretch of road themselves. The two of them rising before 5 every morning for over 2 decades. The loaves cooling on wooden racks by sunrise, while the rest of the street was still asleep. She had told almost no one in the market, in 12 years, that she used to own anything at all. It was easier to be overlooked than to be pitied, and she had chosen overlooked a long time ago. She was not trying to get the bakery back. She had stopped letting herself want that around the 3rd year. What she was trying to do, on the Wednesday evening the bread was taken back out of her hands, was make it to Friday, when her landlord, a soft-spoken man named Festus, would knock on her door for the 1,100 naira she still owed him for the month. And she did not yet have it. She could no longer afford flour. She could still recite the ratio in her sleep: 4 cups, 2 level spoons, a pinch of Uda ground fine, 3 drops of palm oil brushed on the crust, and no more. 41 years of 5 a.m. mornings had carved those numbers into her the way running water carves a stone, slowly and permanently, long after the water itself is gone. When the bread came back out of her hands that evening, she did not lower her eyes. She did not raise her voice. She folded her empty palms one over the other, the way her mother had taught her to stand before an elder she did not yet understand, and she waited for him to finish. After the door closed behind her at 7:14, she walked across the market square to the row of blue-painted shipping containers serving as the security post and stood in line behind two sweepers waiting to report a missing wheelbarrow. When it was her turn, she explained, evenly, the way she explained everything, that the bread had been given to her freely by an employee of that shop and then taken back from her by the owner's son. The warden behind the desk, a man named Gerald Osai, did not look up from his ledger. "We cannot police every loaf of bread in this market, Mama," he said, and underlined something in red. By his own accounting, he was simply following procedure. He had already filed 11 theft reports that week, none above 400 naira, in a market that processed some 9,000 transactions a day, and bread, in his ledger, did not qualify as theft if the giver and the taker worked for the same business. What Gerald did not write down was what kind of woman had stood in front of his desk for the 4 minutes it took him to dismiss her. He looked at the mended hem of her wrapper before he looked at her face. He had done this with nearly every stranger who approached that desk for 9 years, and he had never once noticed himself doing it. Above Gerald's desk, a small camera blinked its red light toward the bakery's front door, the way it had for the past 3 years, recording footage that was never reviewed unless a theft crossed 50,000 naira. A loaf of bread, even taken twice from the same hands in one evening, did not meet that threshold. Gerald knew the number by heart. He did not need to check the footage to know that. 2 traders near the security post watched the whole exchange. One of them, a cloth seller named Roseline, who had known Adize for 6 years and owed her nothing, pulled her shutter halfway down and busied herself folding wax print that did not need folding. She did not call out. She did not look over again until Adize had already walked past her stall and out toward Upper Iweka Road. By 8:40 that night, Adize had asked 3 people for credit and been refused by all 3. Not unkindly, but firmly, the way people refuse when they are also 3 or 4 days from a deadline of their own. Mama Ngozi, who sold rice 2 stalls down, counted out 400 naira from her own apron and pressed it into Adize's hand without being asked. Then closed her hand around it the way you close a hand around something that should not be looked at too closely. It was not enough for the rent. It was enough for tomorrow. She had eaten nothing since a cup of gari at noon. By evening, the hunger had moved past her stomach and settled somewhere behind her eyes, a low pressure that made the market's lights look slightly too bright when she finally turned for home. She had felt this particular pressure often enough over 12 years to know it would pass by morning, the way it always did, and she did not mention it to anyone, because there was no one left to mention it to who could do anything about it. The rain that had been threatening since 5 o'clock finally broke a little after 9, the kind of rain that turned the gutters along Upper Iweka Road into shallow brown rivers within minutes, and sent every umbrella in the market folding shut at once. Adize did not have an umbrella. She walked the half-kilometer home with her wrapper soaked through to the skin, her sandals filling with water at every step, the smell of wet dust and diesel and frying akara rising off the road the way it always did after the first heavy rain of the week. She did not run. Running had never gotten her home any drier, only more tired, and she had stopped running years ago. She tried one more door before she turned for home that night. Festus himself, the landlord, in case he might allow her 3 extra days. He answered in his vest, a transistor radio playing somewhere behind him, and told her, not unkindly, that he had already promised her room to his sister's daughter if the rent was not complete by Friday evening. He had 3 children of his own starting school resumption that term, and 400 naira here or there, multiplied across 6 tenants, was the difference between resumption and no resumption. He was not wrong about his own arithmetic. He simply did not know hers. Friday was 3 days away. 1,100 naira was still 1,100 naira. Inside her room that night, By candlelight, she opened the tin box anyway, for the first time in 11 months, and unfolded the single sheet of paper along its 8 worn creases. She did not read it. She had it memorized. She refolded it, put it back, and pushed the box under the short leg of the stool, where it had sat for 12 years doing absolutely nothing for her, except existing. The next morning, a regular customer named Mr. Ifeanyi stood at the counter of that same bakery, broke a piece off a fresh loaf, and frowned at it before he had even finished chewing. "This is not the same bread," he said to no one in particular. "It used to have something in it, something at the back of the tongue." The owner's son, behind the register, told him the recipe had not changed in 12 years. Mr. Ifeanyi bought the bread anyway. He did not come back the following morning. Above the door of that bakery, where the owner's son stood each morning to unlock the padlock, a strip of paint 2 shades lighter than the wall around it ran the length of the lintel, the ghost of an older sign someone had scraped off and repainted years before he was old enough to ask why. Nobody had ever told him what the first sign said. He had never thought to ask. That same Thursday, Tobena found Adeyeze near the Orange Sellers Row before the market filled, and pressed half a loaf of yesterday's bread into her hands, wrapped, as always, in newspaper, the ink from a 3-day-old headline smudged faintly onto the crust. "Don't tell him I gave you this," he said. It was the 4th time in 2 weeks he had said exactly that sentence. On Friday morning, with 600 naira in her wrapper pocket and Festus expected before sundown, Adeyeze remembered that Pauline Ndukwe, who had sold roasted plantain from the same corner stall for 31 years, had once mentioned working as a records clerk at the old magistrate's court on Niger Street before the plantain business. She found Pauline at 10 o'clock, turning plantain over a charcoal pot, and asked her, plainly, whether old loan papers from 12 years back would still exist anywhere. Pauline went still in a way that made Adeyeze repeat the question. "They are clearing those files this month," Pauline said. "Making room." "I know, because my niece works there now." She did not say anything else for almost a full minute, only turned the plantain twice more than it needed turning. Then she asked Adeyeze to come to her house that evening, after the market closed, and to bring nothing. She would have everything Adeyeze needed already. The clearing, Pauline would explain later, was scheduled to finish by the following Monday, 4 days from that Friday morning, after which every box in the records room on Niger Street would go to a recycling depot on the edge of town. Pauline's niece had only mentioned it to her in passing, the way you mention weather, with no idea what it would set in motion. Adeyeze walked home that afternoon believing, for the first time in 3 days, that Friday might end differently than she had planned. She did not yet know that the file Pauline was describing had a deadline of its own, and that it was shorter than her landlord's. Pauline's house sat behind a carpentry workshop 2 streets off Upper Iweka Road, a single room with a curtain instead of a door for the kitchen. She had Adeyeze sit on the only chair in the house and brought out, from beneath her own mattress, a brown envelope gone soft and furred at the corners, the kind of softness that comes only from 12 years of being handled and never thrown away. "I was 26 when I typed this," Pauline said. "I am 58 now." She had not pulled the envelope out lightly. Keeping a copy of a closed court file had never been within her rights as a clerk, and she had known it the day she made it. Folding the carbon copy into her handbag during her lunch hour and telling herself she would destroy it within the year. She had told herself the same thing every year since. Inside the envelope was a copy of the original loan agreement between Emeka Okafor and the bakery's first owner, dated the year before Emeka died. The bakery building listed as collateral against a loan of 185,000 naira taken out to keep the ovens running through his illness. Adeyeze had seen this part before. What she had not seen because the magistrate's office had never given her a copy, was the second page, a handwritten note in the lender's own script, signed and dated 4 days after the typed agreement, granting a 90-day grace period on any missed payment in the event of Emeka's death. In recognition, the note read, "Of 22 years of friendship between our families." Adaeze had missed her third payment by 9 days. The building had been filed for repossession on day 10. He never honored his own handwriting, Pauline said. I typed the agreement myself. I watched him sign the note. And 3 weeks after he took the building, my supervisor told me the file was closed and that closed files were not my concern anymore. She had kept her copy anyway, first in a drawer at the courthouse, then, after she left the job, inside a Bible, then inside a mattress, moving it 4 times in 12 years, in a town where she had no reason to believe anyone would ever ask to see it. If you have ever had something taken from you by someone who was certain you would never be able to prove it was yours, stay with me, because what was written at the bottom of that second page, in red ink, added almost as an afterthought by a magistrate's clerk who had since died, was the reason half of Onitsha would be standing outside that bakery by the following morning. Pauline turned the page over. She did not read it aloud. She slid it across the small table between them and watched Adaize's face as she read it herself. Twice, the candle between them burning low enough now that the shadows on the wall had stopped moving with the flame and started moving with her hand. "Can this still be used?" Adaize asked, after 12 years. She asked it the way she asked everything, without raising her voice, though her hands, folded in her lap the way her mother had taught her, had gone very still. The man Pauline called that night, a little after 11, was not anyone from the bakery family. It was the palace of Igwe Chukwuemeka Nwosu, traditional ruler of the town's central market quarter for the past 19 years. A man whose own grandfather, it turned out, had been the magistrate's clerk who had signed that final line in red ink himself. Pauline had carried that fact alongside the document for 12 years without ever finding the reason to use it. Tonight, she found one. At 7:40 the next morning, 11 hours after that phone call, a white Toyota Land Cruiser, with no markings, parked across both entrances of the side street leading to the bakery. Gerald Osei, the same warden who had underlined Adaize's complaint in red and dismissed it in 4 minutes, was the first person at the market to see the vehicle, and the first person to straighten his collar without anyone telling him to. The Igwe did not announce himself. He stepped out in a plain white agbada, with no chieftaincy beads, no entourage beyond his driver and one elderly aide carrying a leather folder, and walked the 40 meters to the bakery door at a pace no faster than anyone else's morning walk. By the time he reached it, 11 traders had already stopped what they were doing. Roseline, the cloth seller who had pulled her shutter halfway down 3 days earlier, pulled it all the way up. The owner's son came out from behind his counter, still wiping flour from his hands, and for the first time in the conversation, he did not finish a sentence before someone interrupted him. Near the back of the gathering crowd, Tobena stood very still, with a tray of unsold rolls balanced against his hip, watching the same doorway he had quietly carried bread through 4 times in 2 weeks. He did not say anything either. He did not need to. Open the books. 4 words. His hand, still holding the cloth he had been using to wipe flour, stopped moving in the air between the counter and his apron. It hung there a moment, then came slowly back down. "Sir, my father is not," he began. "I know where your father is. Bring the deed." It took him 9 minutes to find it, in a metal box under the same counter where, 3 nights earlier, the bread had been dropped back into the display case. When he placed it down, the Igwe did not open it. He set Pauline's brown envelope beside it instead and turned to his aide, who began reading the second page aloud, slowly, in the flat voice of a man reading something into an official record rather than telling a story. By the time the aide reached the line about the 90-day grace period, 6 more traders had drifted over from neighboring stalls. By the time he reached the date, 4 days after the typed agreement, in a dead man's own hand, a daisy, standing at the back of the small crowd in the same indigo wrapper she had worn 3 nights before, watched the owner's son's face change in a way she did not have a name for and did not need one. He did not apologize out loud. He sat down on an overturned flour sack just inside the doorway and did not speak for several minutes. Gerald, watching from just inside the doorway with the others, did not write anything down. He had learned, in the space of about 90 seconds, that some things did not belong in a ledger. The Igwe turned to a daisy. "This building returns to your name," he said. Nothing more needed saying in that moment, and he did not say more. What followed came from the AD's leather folder, rather than the Igwe's own mouth, full ownership restored within the month, half held in trust for her grandchildren until they came of age, exactly as her husband's original agreement had intended 12 years before it was broken. "Sir," the owner's son said from the flour sack, "I can pay her, whatever the building is worth, in cash, today, if she will only. This is not about what you can pay." "Monday," the Igwe added, looking at him directly for the first time. "You will apprentice under her starting Monday. You have never known the recipe. You have only ever guessed at it." He did not say anything further about the bakery family's standing in the Traders Association, or the smaller debts the family was rumored to owe other widows around town. He did not need to. By 9:15 that morning, 3 other women from different corners of the market had quietly asked Pauline whether she still had any of their old files too. By the end of that year, the Traders Association had opened a dispute file of its own kind for the first time in its history, with Pauline appointed, at 58, to run it 2 mornings a week from a small table near the entrance gate. 3 more cases would be settled before the next Harmattan season, none of them as old as Adaize's, all of them belonging to women the market had simply stopped looking at directly a long time ago. Gerald Osai filed an updated theft report before noon. It was the first one he had ever written in red ink. The bakery family believed that 9 days were long enough to take a sick man's bakery away from his widow, and for 12 years, the silence of an entire market agreed with them. But the truth is, that seizure could never reach the one thing that actually mattered. Not the building. Not the sign above the door. Adaize's hand still knew the ratio: 4 cups, 2 spoons, a pinch of Uda, 3 drops of palm oil, and no more, the way they had known it since she was 30 years old, and no contract, however quickly it was filed, can repossess what a person carries inside their own memory. You can change the name painted above a door. You can scrape off the old sign and repaint it twice over, and let a son grow up never asking what used to be written there. But you cannot bake what you were never taught, and you cannot erase a debt simply because the person you owe it to has grown old enough and quiet enough that you assumed she had stopped counting. 12 years of silence from an entire market never once made the second page of that envelope untrue. On the first Monday of the following month, Adaize Okafor stood behind the same counter she had stood behind 41 years earlier, her sleeves pushed up past her elbows, flour settling soft and white across the backs of her hands, while a 19-year-old apprentice and a 24-year-old one stood on either side of her, measuring exactly what she told them to measure. The smell of Uda and warm crust moved out through the open door and down Upper Iweka Road, the way it had before either young man behind that counter was born. Tobena no longer wrapped bread in newspaper to give away when no one important was watching. He no longer needed to. The sign above the door now carried 2 names instead of 1. The new paint still a shade darker than the wall around it, not yet faded by the 20 years of weather that would slowly even the 2 of them out. She did not say much that morning. She did not need to. She simply turned over the first loaf of the day, checked its underside the way she had checked 10,000 mornings before it, and set it down to cool. If you found out tomorrow that the fortune someone built their whole life on was something they quietly took from a woman who had nothing left for anyone to take, would you say something? Or would you do what an entire market did for 12 years and decide it simply wasn't your bread to defend? Leave your answer in the comments below. I want to read what you would do. If stories like this one, about the people the world stops counting, and what they were quietly carrying the whole time, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.